I'd like to hand over to Ilan and ask him in particular to perhaps explain a little bit how this looks from Washington, what the escalation dynamics look like, what the current administration might think about them, and how you judge this whole puzzle. Ilan, please.
Sure. Well, thank you, and thank you for having me. Thank you to Bastian and to IISS and to Hanns Seidel Foundation. Very much great to be here and join all of you. So I thought what I'd do is talk a little bit about where we are today, then talk about potential escalation dynamics, and then some ways to, maybe there's some opportunities to de-escalate. And while we're at it, I think talk for a couple minutes also about the situation with the British tanker that's obviously on everybody's mind as well. So look, for the, Donald Trump walked out of the JCPOA in May of 2018. And for the year afterwards, Iran conducted a policy, at least in this arena, continues with, and I'm sure we'll hear from Emile about all the things it continues to do in the region, which was pretty restrained, in that the entire strategy was, let's isolate the United States from Europe and the other members of the P5+1. Let's stay in the nuclear deal and see if we can get economic benefits from Europe and from China and Russia. The strategy was a partial success in that it did manage to create a political rift between the United States and the other members of the P5+1, but it did nothing to get Iran the economic benefits that it expected from the JCPOA and still wanted to see from the P5 other members of the P5+1. And I think so. You have this year of debate going on inside of Iran on how to respond, and you have. Then I think finally I would say the straw that breaks the camel's back and really causes a shift in strategy is when the American administration announces it's going to be taking, basically no longer providing waivers for Iran to sell its oil and trying to take Iranian oil sales down to zero from 2.5 million barrels per day where they were during the implementation of the JCPOA. That happens at the end of April of this year, and suddenly in early May we start seeing 4 tankers sabotaged in Fujairah, an announcement about starting to slowly withdraw from the JCPOA. They're still playing that. Then, in my mind, the most stunning move, which was targeting 2 tankers in the Gulf of Oman while you had the Japanese prime minister in Tehran for the first time in 40 years. To me, that was brazen, and also hitting a Japanese flagship, which it's not 100% clear to me if they necessarily knew it was Japanese or not, but seems like most likely scenarios they did. To me, that's a fundamental shift in strategy. And with the shooting down of the drone and now the latest incidents. And I think the fundamental shift in strategy was those who are arguing the only thing that works with the Americans is to show force and to push back, and we need to demonstrate that force. Then when it comes to, it's also sending a signal to other members of the P5+1 and other major, countries like Japan saying, you can't continue to, say you want to be in the JCPOA and not give us anything, even though none of these countries, these governments might want to engage economically with Iran to preserve the JCPOA. Their companies will not because of fear of losing access to the American financial system. But still, I think it was a message to those players. And it was also a message to the Gulf, to the Saudis and the Emiratis in particular. If you're not going to let us sell our oil, then we're not going to let you sell your oil. So I think all of those things are playing into it. Now, the good news is I don't think that either Donald Trump or the Iranian leadership want a war. Neither side wants a war, right? So both are interested, and we saw that with the drone incident last month. We went right up to the precipice, and then we pulled back. It's because I think Iran knows that in a direct conflict with the United States, it loses, and things are very bad. And Donald Trump campaigned on not getting us into more conflicts in the Middle East. So that's the good news. The bad news is it can still happen. It almost did happen, right? And really, it's driven by 2 things. One is just miscalculation. Neither side precisely understands the other's red lines. And so, as I see it, it's a scenario where, some missiles, for example, that are being launched by the Houthis actually inadvertently kill Americans who happen to be in Saudi Arabia. Iran miscalculates and, launches, some of its proxies launch an attack in Iraq that kills Americans. The U.S. then responds with something very, it starts a lot like talking about Syria 2017 or 18, right? It starts with, Mr. President, you can just respond. They just took out our drone. You can take out the missiles that were associated with that drone. They just killed some of our people in Iraq. You can hit some of these logistics supply hubs. You can hit some of these training camps in Iran. That's where it starts. But then you end up in a tit for tat where things are escalating. So the Iranians feel like they have to strike back. We, the United States, feel like we have to strike back. That's actually, we played this war game out in CNAS at my institution a couple months ago, and this is exactly what we found. Both sides did not want to fight, but both sides felt like, well, we have to respond one more time to clarify that, that we are deterring and that the message is clear, and then we'll go talk to them. And boop, 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 up you go, until you get to a situation, frankly, where the U.S. military comes to the President of the United States and says, this tit-for-tat thing is not working for us. We're having missiles hit our targets in the Gulf. We're having mines dropped in the Strait. We're having to do all these different things. A much smarter move would just be to take out as much of Iran's capability in a sort of short period of time. Basically, Gulf War I. Think about it as Gulf War I. We're going to take out as much of Iran's naval capabilities, as much of their missile capabilities. We'll take out the nuclear program while we're at it, do as much as we can. And the U.S. could do that in probably a few weeks. But Iran would exact a heavy toll in that scenario. You'll have rockets probably launching from, Hezbollah into Israel, potentially triggering a war there. I don't know, Emile, if you necessarily agree that would happen in that scenario. It's an open question. You'd have, cyber attacks on Saudi infrastructure. You'd have maybe sabotage attacks on major oil facilities in the Gulf. You'd have attacks on Americans in Iraq and Syria, elsewhere. You could have efforts to try to, hit targets, across the globe. Some of that won't work. A lot of it will be foiled. Iran's not this 10-foot giant that can pull all these things off. But, they'll do enough so that bad things do happen. Oil prices will go up dramatically. We'll be in a tough situation. And the question is, what do you do after you've, sunk Iran's navy? Now you're stuck there probably for years on end. And who's going to foot the bill for that? And how does that work in containing Iran in the aftermath? So that's one scenario. The other one that gets you there is, as opposed to miscalculation, is an accident like, for example, the American sailors who wandered into Iranian waters in 2016, were taken by the RIGC Navy for a few hours. John Kerry and Javad Zarif were on the phone immediately and spent a lot of time working that out and de-escalating that situation. In today's environment, there are no channels, real channels. There are some channels, but they're not very good. There's no trust. There wasn't much trust then either, but still there were relationships. The likelihood that explodes into something much more dramatic, I think, is also possible. And again, you're going up the same escalation ladder. So just to say a couple of things before I close, one on just the situation with the British tanker. I think right now we're kind of stuck on that one. I don't think there's a good scenario out. Maybe the most likely way I see out eventually is some kind of negotiation where the crews are exchanged, but the tankers might be sitting there for months, years. I wouldn't be surprised. Maybe I'm wrong. But we really are, and the UK is very stuck because, I think the UK fears getting drawn into a much larger conflict, which is what happens if it ties itself too closely to the United States. There's a danger of that. But on the other hand, what alternative does it have? It doesn't have the capacity to do it by itself. And I'm not sure, there's all kinds of ideas out there about potentially starting basically escorted trips through, what they're calling Operation Sentinel. This is like a rehash of the 1980s. That's expensive. It takes a lot of ships. It also takes a lot of time, and you can't put that many ships through in one convoy. So if we're really going down that pathway, that's going to cause some pretty significant, reduction in global oil flow through the Strait. So I think we should all be ready for that if that's the scenario we're talking about here. And frankly, we're doing a little more research right now at my institution on sort of like looking at numbers and talking to military folks about precisely what the implications are. But yeah, I really feel, for that there are no real good options. And maybe this possibly should have been thought through a little more before the tanker was taken in Gibraltar first. Just to close on possibility of sort of de-escalation. Donald Trump wants to talk. It's very clear. He keeps telling everybody he wants to talk. He keeps trying to send messages. He sent Abe over there. That didn't work out so well. But it seems like for a while the Iranians did not want to talk. Their view was, we'd be rewarding Trump for walking away from the JCPOA. We are too proud to be negotiating with this guy who's been so belligerent towards us. Fundamentally, we're not Kim Jong-un. We don't need to be on a world stage with Donald Trump. We've already been on the world stage. But things seem to be shifting there a little bit too. Zarif was in New York last week floating a proposal that I think has very little chance of success. But at least he's floating proposals out there. He met with Rand Paul, a very conservative American congressman, senator, but who also is sort of from the sort of non-interventionist side of the Republican Party. So there's noise being made at this point on both sides about engagement that hadn't been there before, maybe to de-escalate. The question is how. I have a hard time seeing the more hardline elements in the administration being willing to give Iran anything. It's going to need to be some kind of a deal where the U.S. is willing to pull back on some sanctions in exchange for Iran pulling back on some of its behavior. I can't see Mike Pompeo or John Bolton agreeing to that, but if there's a channel that can go directly around them to the President of the United States directly, like the North Korea channel, where the South Koreans were the channel. I actually thought the Japanese could have been a good channel, but there are others. Rand Paul is a possible channel. You can get a deal where Trump does something at least immediate with Iran to de-escalate. Then you go into negotiations where the much more hardline elements inside the administration take over, and you're going to be stuck and you're going to make no progress. But at least you've got some kind of short-term freeze on sort of calming the tensions. So to me, that seems like the best option right now. It's almost like North Korea redux. Minus the summit, because the Iranians will never do the summit. You're not going to see Rouhani or the supreme leader walking up the stage with Donald Trump. But something along those lines might be the best option that you have. So maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ilan. Thank you very much for walking us through these arguments and explaining the scenarios that you see, how you can end up in a situation that actually nobody wants, but is still a very real possibility, and then outlining some of the options and the ways of getting to these options, and none of which sounds easy to me. DPRK Redux is certainly an interesting way to think about this. Emile, I wondered whether you can add to this, build on this by perhaps talking a little bit about Iran's perspective on these things and other views from the region that no doubt influence very much how this will go forward, and of course react to anything you just heard from Ilan.
Certainly, good afternoon. So first, it's important to understand that the nuclear deal, which was always a technical agreement aimed at addressing a specific issue, which was nuclear proliferation, always contained in itself, always carried in itself the ingredients for future disappointment and tensions. And in reality, after the deal was agreed to in 2015, there was a policy vacuum over Iran in Washington and elsewhere. Because of, it was a diplomatic achievement, so, you rest and celebrate. Also because you have the campaign against ISIS happening at the same time, because you have the Russian intervention in Syria, and because you have wishful thinking in some Washington elites and elsewhere about the potential then for US recalibration and regional reordering. Remember the famous Obama quote in The Atlantic in April 2016 that now Iran and Saudis can somehow share the region. So the problem was not necessarily the terms of the deal from the perspective of a number of regional actors and elsewhere. It was more the diplomacy and the assumptions and the expectations around the deal. And this is what we see happening right now. This is the context in which Trump came with his hammer, essentially. And what happened between 2015 and last year, when the U.S. Really adopted this much more aggressive approach, is that The proponents of the deal credited the deal with all the current good and future good that could happen, and the opponents of the deal blamed the deal for everything bad that happened. Instead of actually trying to think more broadly about what an engagement, but also a pushback strategy would look like. So the fundamental problem today is that the US administration chose to address the shortcoming of the situation the worst possible way, by punishing Iran on the one issue where Iran is actually abiding by its obligation, which is the nuclear dimension. And by making that the focus of its ire and its communication and so on, it has actually weakened its hand on other issues. So how to understand the current escalation? I think so far Iran has responded quite well. The response has been calibrated. It's tit for tat. It's broadly seen as reactive, responsive to American provocation, even when it's not warranted, but still, this is a broadly shared perspective. So far, there has been no loss of life in any of these incidents, which is actually quite important to note. And Iran seems to be going up the escalatory ladder in a smarter way than the US, which went from 0 to 100 in a year. Now, it's important to understand that in this context, limited conflict is a form of Iranian deterrence. It raises the fear and the cost of regional actors by reminding them of their own vulnerability. So, this slow drip of actions here and there are really, unnerving regional actors. It puts a divided US administration in front of complicated choices and dilemmas, and it exacerbates what Ilan was talking about, which is Trump not necessarily being in line with other advisors. It mobilizes the EU and other actors who want to save, who want to create the space no matter what, and in a way just put them in the most uncomfortable possible position, because in the process they reveal their own weakness. And fundamentally, from a strategic perspective, what Iran is doing, which is deterrence signaling, so there is a very thin line between deterrence signaling and provocation. And that's every time there is an incident, this is what we spend our time doing. It's like, how do you see that from Iran's perspective? How do you see that from the perspective of regional actors? And how do you see that from the US perspective? And each of us will interpret that the way it's most convenient to our analysis or our assumptions, which is a big problem. So Iran is benefiting in this escalatory context from three things. The first one, which Ilan and I keep stressing, is that there's widespread distrust of Trump and his Iranian strategy, including in the Middle East. Strategically speaking, the driver of this escalation is the US decision to withdraw from the JCPOA, right? The second point is Iran's continuous advantage in terms of plausible deniability. And it's sometimes very problematic. After the first tankers attack, the number of people who said it could be Iran or the others behind the attack was incredible. Right? Mm-hmm. There was no balance of probability where it could be 50% Iran and 50% the others, okay? Mohammed bin Zayed and Mohammed bin Salman somehow cooking it up in Fujairah. But guess what? It was seen as credible among credible policymakers and analysts, mm-hmm. which is a problem in terms of those policymakers and analysts, which is also a problem in terms of the Trump administration. But it's also a reminder of how skewed our discussion over Iran can be, that, that was, perhaps there was some mischief and, Gulf of Tonkin analogies and other things, which I think help Iran in the process, although one can say, the US is strategically responsible for all that, but also let's look at what Iran's specific mischief is. Or the Japanese tankers episode, the number of people who said, it's not possible that Iran was behind the attack because Khamenei was meeting with Abe at that moment. Well, this is our assumption that somehow this would be a restraint on Iran's behavior. But clearly, the Iranians actually saw a benefit from that one. This episode says more about ourselves and our assumptions about Iranian decision-making than about the situation itself. I mean, so relatedly, I think there is a danger in here as well, which for the whole situation is that the way Western national security elites and political elites have adjusted and have internalized Iranian behavior, right? So the way we respond to a lot of these actions is to say, oh, this is what Iran always does, and this is what it did in the past, right? So the way we process those attacks at times, numbs us. And actually, it creates potentially a greater prospect for escalation. And that's one of my concerns in all this, by dismissing that as, it's more of the same. Now, there are two aspects to Iran's escalation right now. I think the regional one, which Ilan covered in his talk, is focused on oil exports. I think it was, it is seen perhaps as a legitimate way, a legitimate answer. If Iran cannot export oil, it will make harder for others to export oil. Now, what's interesting is that the message has been understood that Iran can complicate maritime traffic, it can do so, but it hasn't really led to a massive spike in oil prices, for instance. I think the oil markets have internalized, have priced in some of that dynamic. At the same time, risk premiums have gone up. So it shows you a bit how a variety of actors are behaving. From a military perspective, what's interesting is that the early attacks happened outside the Persian Gulf, not inside it. I mean, I think it was quite interesting that it started in Fujairah, in the Arabian Sea, etc., and not inside the Persian Gulf itself. If it had happened inside the Persian Gulf at the beginning, I think the calculation of number of regional actors would have been a bit different. Outside the Persian Gulf, the reaction time, the puzzlement of people in Saudi, in the UAE, in the US, like, what's the thinking there, did give us a bit more time to react to some of those issues. The other form of Iranian escalation, and on which I personally have no technical expertise, there are others in the room here who can answer that better, but it's the small reversible infractions to the JCPOA. I mean, Iran is not, dashing for the bomb. What it's doing is like clever signaling. It is not something that the international community, especially the Europeans, can't live with. They're just worried about where this could lead. But everything that the Iranians are doing today is reversible, and they're making sure that people know it's reversible, so it's not seen as this massive provocation. And it's interesting that the Europeans have decided to deal with that as almost a technical issue rather than raise it as some massive political crisis. And where Iran is also served at that level is that when the US calls for Iran to respect the terms of a deal it just left, it shows US hypocrisy, right? I mean, and it's the US that's again on the back foot. Brian Hook and others may not feel it that way, but beyond that small circle, there's some gal in calling a country that is respecting or still within a deal, to respect those terms when you violated them yourself. Now the question here is really understanding what Iran is seeking and all that, and is this escalation a first pushback because the Iranian leadership understandably felt slighted and lied to and so on, or is it more of a bargaining strategy? I mean, that you're positioning yourself slowly to negotiate either with Trump, if the pain becomes too big, or for if you can manage that pain over the next year and a half with whomever comes next in the White House. So it's also about building leverage. It's also about looking strong to domestic constituencies. This is not an irrational approach by Iran, just irrational, totally provocative. The point is that, Khamenei is on record saying no talks ever with this crowd, right? So how you manage, a possible diplomatic track in the future is very unclear to me at this point. There's always the suggestion, that you made, Ilan and others, is that for it to work, you should go around Pompeo and Bolton It strikes me as one of the worst possible idea. I hear it all the time. And you certainly wouldn't write would you write a piece that says, when it comes to Iran, you should work around who? I mean, I just think that the danger, the risk of disappointment and actually making things worse by trying to play the politics of Washington or play the politics of Iran is very high. You deal with whomever is in front of you. And the risk of just thinking that you can calibrate the approach is quite high. You may disagree, and so the key question to which I have no answer is how does the fragmented security elite assess Iran's own strengths over time as sanctions bite? Is Iran stronger now than it would be a year from now? So therefore, you're better turning up the pressure now than actually slowly or doing it or pushing back to later? Is the bet about outweighting Trump going to work, because that could backfire badly? And for the EU, the huge dilemma in the next year and a half is the following: is how do you calibrate the incentives you offer to Iran so that Iran is satisfied, but that the US is not totally alienated? And this is where you see the Europeans try hard. It's probably impossible to get to that sweet point, but trying, or at least appearing to try, will buy some time and space. Now, a quick view from the region. Of course, there's no single view from the region. There are as many views as there are countries, and the spectrum basically ranges from no war at all costs, and and in some cases, let's close our eyes to what the Iranians are doing, to like maximum pressure is the way to go, without necessarily defining an endpoint. Now, contrary to widespread assumptions, I see no war wish in Riyadh or Abu Dhabi. I mean, and I think that's important to understand. I don't think the regional actors are the drivers in the escalation, that they want war, they want the next strike, and so on. I think it's built in very often in Western analysis. I mean, I've been quite struck by how widespread that is. It's really not how I see it from talking to the region, living in it for a very long time. From their perspective, maximum pressure is containment plus, right? Now, of course, containment plus is not good enough. That's what we would argue. Containment without a form of engagement, without enough ramp, without actually understanding where you want to get, is either a road to nowhere, think Cuba, sorry for the bad analogies, or a road to war, Iraq, right? So it's not because they don't have a war wish, then what the Gulf states have in mind is good enough. But it's not. I mean, let's not confuse the two, because things will play out differently because of that difference. The problem, as ever, is how, if you're sitting in Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, or elsewhere, you interpret Iranian moves, and in particular these days, the lack of U.S. pushback, what is perceived as that. One view, which I've heard recently, is that look, pressure is working, the Iranians are unnerved. Actually saying that because the Iranians are more reckless, U.S. strategy is failing is nonsense. And sometimes we have to be careful about this argument very often, that look, because the Iranians are pushing back, the U.S. strategy is not working, right? It's like saying that Obama's strategy was not working during pressure because the Iranians were pushing back at the time, and yet you did have an output. I happen to think the U.S. strategy is not going to work, but we have to be careful about the causality we're creating between these. So let's not freak out. Let's give the American times. Let's not be overly hawkish and so on. The other view, which I've also heard, is that look, Iran is getting away with lots of provocations at this point. The incident of the drone that was shot by the U.S. and how the White House managed that process, in the typical messy Trump way, did not actually inspire a lot of fear. They would have preferred not to see this escalation and this walk back rather than this messed up process. But fundamentally, the fear of those regional actors is like, look, the US and the EU are self-deterring now. And actually, it's making things worse because it allows Iran to set new rules of escalation in the region. So just to end here, the concern that I've seen is, go back to North Korea, is will Trump pull out a DPRK essentially? But as Ilan said, and I think others who are Iran specialists around here will agree, Trump is not going to get his summit moment. He's not. I mean, there won't be a picture of Iran with Khamenei or Rouhani for that matter. I may be wrong, and people tell me. But this is a concern in the region, that somehow the theatrics of diplomacy will matter more than the substance of it. And that's quite pervasive. The other issue is that while we're all, hyperventilating, understandably, what's happening in the waters of the Persian Gulf and elsewhere, is that there's still no regional strategy. I mean, it's very difficult to see the coherence of U.S. moves in Syria or with the U.S. withdrawing diplomats from Iraq and so on, with a more deliberate political U.S. approach to build support for what it's doing. So you have those very contradictory signs that come out of Washington, which actually make a lot of regional countries concerned. The debate in D.C. is also not helping from that perspective. The way Congress is taking over, I'm not arguing whether it should or shouldn't, that's a different matter, but if you're sitting far and you're looking at how the debate in Washington is unfolding, the backlash on Yemen and so on, you are in a pretty weak point. So, final point, the current tensions, what the current tensions are doing is that they're magnifying and exacerbating the many issues that have been left unaddressed and unresolved in the region for a very long time. So when you look at Iraq, the PMU issue has been with us, the Shia militias, has been with us for a few years now. We're still nowhere close to a resolution, and yet this is emerging as a key flashpoint. All this is not necessarily Trump's doing, it's shortcomings in the region. It's also the fact that there hasn't been any reasonable, successful strategy of engaging and pushing back on Iran in the region at the same time. I think it's in the region, if the potential for escalation is still most pronounced in the waters in terms of maritime security, and don't forget about how it would play out in Iraq, in Yemen, in Syria, out of a small incident in which American lives or others are affected, and then it escalates from there. So thank you.
Emile, thank you very much for adding that context and that perspective, and for giving a sense of what Iran might be after and how some of this plays in the region. I think that was a very good dimension to add to our conversation. So I'll invite now questions and comments. There'll be roving microphones, so please wait until the microphone comes to you. I will take a group of 3 in the first batch, then we'll return to the panel. And if you have the microphone, if you could please identify yourself so that we know who you're speaking for or who you are. And if I can start with second row here, if I can get a microphone in the second row. Gentleman here, if you could ask a question.
Khalid Nadeem, South Asian Middle East Forum. Thank you for your presentations. How do you see the change? We have a new Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who's almost certain to be the Prime Minister, a change in foreign policy. I mean, Boris Johnson is likely to be on the same page as Donald Trump on a lot of things as regarding foreign policy. So how do you think, will this escalate tension, or do you think it's going to be a plateau of calm before tension? And secondly, how do you see the British Navy dealing with this confrontation with Iran? I mean, the experts say that the British Navy isn't equipped to deal with it, and that basically if we were to deal with this situation, we're going to have to rely on the US to support us.
Thank you very much. If you could just hand the microphone across the aisle. Yes.
Thank you very much. Ian Black from the Middle East Centre at LSE. Could I ask you to address the question of the seizure of the Iranian tanker in Gibraltar? And do you think specifically that there is any credibility to the claim that this was, I mean, it's been widely reported that it was done at the behest of the US, and that somehow Britain fell into a trap laid by John Bolton obviously on the hawkish end of the spectrum, because as everybody knows, the rubric for that was EU sanctions against Syria. I'm not talking about the legality of it, but whether there was, something behind the scenes, as it were. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Question at the back of the room, and then we'll come back to the front. Yes? Yes, sir.
I will follow up from that. Norman Dombey, University of Sussex. I wanted to talk about the peculiarities of the UK-Iran situation. We've heard a lot of interesting material about US-Iran. There are several peculiarities in the case of the British pretense Gibraltar seizure of the Iranian tanker. First, it was a US request. It may even been a US order which caused Britain to seize the tanker. We know this because they also asked the Spaniards to do the same. And the Spanish Foreign Minister, Borrell, reported on this. Al Jazeera reported initially that the US ordered the British Navy to take the vessel. It then softened its language to request. It could have ordered because Northwood, which is the headquarters of the Navy, is also a NATO base. And what we're not sure of yet, whether any minister was consulted when the Royal Marines took the boat. We do know that the FCO was very embarrassed the following day, but it's still not clear whether the Foreign Office or the Ministry of Defence even was consulted. Second thing is the EU sanctions. This seems very much a pretense by Britain to, once it has seized the tanker, to pretend it was nothing to do with the US. I say it's a pretense because EU sanctions on Syria, which I've inspected very briefly, and I'm not a lawyer, nevertheless don't, on the face of it, apply to foreign boats. They apply to EU entities, that is states, companies, civilians, not to foreign boats.
Can I ask you to come to a conclusion so that
Sure.
we can get a few more people in? Thank you.
And the EU is not consulted, the Foreign Affairs section of the EU is not consulted. This seems very much, again, something which was invented because Britain was embarrassed.
Okay, so for the second round, can I ask people to? I'll hand it back to the panel. But for the second round, can I ask those to put their hand up who don't have a British tanker question, so that we can broaden the perspective a little bit. But we have the issue of Boris Johnson. Will it matter or not? Was the UK tricked or ordered into doing these things by the US? And do EU sanctions matter or not? I don't think any of us here is an international lawyer, so maybe we'll take that one lightly. But any thoughts you have on these?
Sure, and I also want to respond to one of Emile's point on the sort of. So let me start with that actually, sort of on how you engage the United States and the Trump administration, and then also get into a couple of these. Look, I'm not sort of saying you. Maybe I was a little flippant and sort of saying go around the hardliners and deal with the president. But the reality actually is, like, it doesn't matter what the issue is in the United States right now. If it's an issue that has high political resonance, like the decider is the president of the United States, and he's relatively unpredictable. So if you want to do anything that's serious, you got to figure out how to talk to him. Like, that's the bottom line on this. I'm not like, and I think that the perfect example of that is actually, the E3 and the EU spent a very admirable 6 months negotiating with the Trump administration, a very technocratic agreement that made a lot of sense about how you could strengthen and keep the JCPOA. And what did the president do? He barely even read it and just tossed it aside and said, no, I'm walking out of the deal. So I think Europe has tried the sort of technocratic, civil or like sort of institutional strategy. It doesn't work with this president. You have to go directly to him. And that's not unique about the US, that there's a lot of countries around the world. Usually the US works more institutionally. That's not the case under this presidency. And so if the issue is something that doesn't rise to that level of political resonance, then you can do it with the bureaucracy, and it's much more like working a normal issue. But if he's gonna be tweeting about it, and if he's gonna be like to be part of an electoral campaign, and it's gonna rise to that level, you gotta talk to him, and like that's the only thing that matters. So that's really what I'm trying to say in terms of any kind of diplomatic move with the United States. On these other questions, I'm really I don't buy the idea that the UK was trapped and tricked by the US and John Bolton, because for the last year on Iran, the United States has been asking the UK and the other members of the P5+1 and the rest of the world to do all kinds of things, and the response at every opportunity has been, no thanks, we disagree with you. So why at this moment, why this decision? I'm not an expert on internal British politics or like decision making here, but I really think it has a lot more to do with something that happened here or is going on here than something to do with some brilliant move by the United States and the National Security Advisor to trap John Bolton. That's where I would put fundamentally the responsibility on what happened here. And I don't think it was the smartest move personally, but this is where we are. So I'll let others comment on that. And then maybe I'll stop there unless there's
I'm paid by the ISS to study the politics of Arab countries, and it's much easier to understand than the politics of Britain these days. So where Bojo sits and how this is going to play out, I don't really know. In terms of the seizure of the tanker, my understanding and my analysis meets that of Ilan. I think it's very easy to think that. This notion that the U.S. ordered the UK, I find a bit problematic given what has been happening in the past year plus. To be honest, this incident shows us something that relates to what I was saying earlier, since 2015, 2016, that there was essentially a policy vacuum. EU sanctions on oil to Syria existed back then, and they weren't implemented in the same aggressiveness. Try to imagine this back then. It would have mattered perhaps in terms of Syrian conflict, it would have mattered in terms of regional strategy and so on. In this context, you seize the tanker, which, as someone who's worked a lot on Syria and has been quite dismayed at the international response to this catastrophe there, I'm like, okay, great, if you can deny some oil to Assad, why not? But from a broader strategic perspective, I do understand that the repercussions and the escalatory consequences were not necessarily understood. You would think that there would have been a bit more awareness about what the next steps would be. Again, this is a point. If the Obama administration and the Europeans back then had shown some teeth on something, that could have counted as part of a regional containment strategy. Today, it's on its own. There's no real organizing principle for some of these moves. The EU sanctions are not just pure pretense. The fact that they're applied too late and in this haphazard way doesn't mean that they are, that they stand for nothing. Again, I'm not an international law expert, but I think there are some strong legal grounds there. The question is why this hasn't happened in the past more frequently. Let me stop here because really, Bojo, no idea.
Sure. Actually, one last thing I do want to say on British naval capability. The UK is really stuck now, I think, in a tough position because I don't think it has the capacity by itself to be protecting all these ships and moving them through the Strait of Hormuz. But who's the partner who can really help them do that most meaningfully? The United States. But the United States is unsure about where the United States might take a situation like that in the Gulf and doesn't really want to be tagged and associated with that. So you're either, something goes wrong and now you're like, hand in glove with the United States as we're going up the escalation ladder in the Gulf. Like that's not something the UK wants. But, you can't have the foreign minister come out and say there's going to be tough consequences. And you have no capability to actually do anything on those tough consequences. So that's a tough position.
Okay, let's get 3 more in. A gentleman over here, what is that, 4th row on the side. Thank you. And then you and you're next, and then we come to the 1st row. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Shao from Chinese Embassy. I've got a question concerning the future of the petroleum market. Now that you mentioned about the Japanese and the Chinese and the others are main importers of the oil, but Trump has been claiming that it's more self-reliance and there aren't much U.S. tankers down there. But how would you look at this situation evolving, and will it be further impacted by the zero export?
Thank you very much. And then if we can pass the microphone 1 row behind.
Thank you very much, Ewan Grant. I've worked on quasi-security, but more developmental financial programs in Yemen and the northern Somalia, so therefore Horn of Africa. My question is partly based on that. How much of a role do you think the European countries, other than the UK, can play in securing the Bab el-Mandeb and the Gulf of Aden, and therefore the southern Red Sea, to reassure Saudi Arabia and perhaps to free up resources for possible support for convoys without giving the impression of an offensive armada forming up in the Gulf of Oman? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we get the microphone in the 1st row here to my left? And then we're going to take a 4th one there in the back. Yes.
My name is Walter Silversmith. I'm the Defense Attaché of the Netherlands. The Netherlands is one of the countries that has been asked by the US government to, let's say, join up and participate in freedom of navigation security in the Gulf region, like we did a couple of centuries ago or a couple of years ago. But my actual question is, what are, let's say, for countries like the Netherlands and other EU nations at this moment, the opportunities, but also the major risks of stepping into this, first of all, US Iran issue, and now UK US Iran issue. What are the possibilities, and also for escalation, de-escalation?
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, PhD candidate at the University of St. Andrews. My question is on the diplomatic front. What concessions do you think the US and Iran are both willing to give, given that the current position on the US is that they want a major overhaul of Iran's foreign policy, and the current position of the Iranian government is that they want no talks at all? Where do you think that they can somehow meet in the middle and give enough concessions that there will be a compromise on the deal, and the deal can go forward for sanctions to be removed as Iran wants it to?
Okay. Last offer. Jonathan? Yeah. Can we get microphone here, and then we'll hand it back to the panel for final
Jonathan Paris, Middle East analyst. Ilan, I want to draw on your previous experience at the Pentagon and ask you, what is the, how do you assess the possible resistance in the Pentagon to any kind of escalation that would require, I think you used the term Desert Storm redo, because you remember that was an enormous troop deployment. I don't think Trump can handle that. But is there a way to, have a war without having a 1990 deployment?
John, thank you very much. Let's hand it back to the panel for kind of responses to this, but also any final remarks they want to make. I want to start with Emile on this. So we'll go reverse order. So we've got petroleum market, we've got European or roles for other Europeans other than the UK, and opportunities that come from this, diplomatic concessions, and if you have thoughts on how you can have a nice little war rather than a big war, I'm sure that we appreciate it by Jonathan as well, but we might also want to leave that for Ilan. Emile, please.
Thank you. I mean, what this current escalation bring back to the table is the perennial discussion about who provides security in the Persian Gulf, who protects sea lanes, at what cost? Is there a replacement for the US? Is there a way for the US to do less than other actors to take up some of the burden? Would regional actors want that for a start? I mean, we're all making the assumption that if the US does less or nothing at some point, that some global power can come in and somehow Iran or others will accept that, automatically. Look, the discussion about so-called free riding has been on for a very long time. Ilan can tell us about this debate in Washington, how much it costs, whether it's worth it. It all depends on whether you believe that oil and energy exports is still, and Gulf security are a global public good, and whether the Chinese and others don't feel, at least at the moment, that they have to do much, because the assumption is that the US will do it